Hi everyone, welcome back. Last week I talked about auditory processing disorder. Today I want to talk about auditory processing disorder and how that is connected to executive functioning, because so often parents get a diagnosis and they find out a child has poor auditory processing or poor executive functioning, but there's not a whole lot of talk about how the two are connected. So I want to go through that and talk about also how the inner ear and the auditory cortex, so like the auditory system in the brain, are so connected, intimately connected in terms of learning. So first I want to tell you about Luke. So Luke was a client of mine several years ago. Mom came to me because he actually had dysgraphia and really poor reading comprehension. And he wasn't much of a talker. It never really came up much. He just said he's pretty quiet. He's an easygoing kid, whatever. They were happy with his overall behavior, but he struggled with learning, processing, organizing, and all that other stuff that goes along with dysgraphia. And once he went through my 6-month program, the Full Potential Formula, and we really worked on not only nutrition and gut healing, but the different exercises and processes that really improve auditory processing, he absolutely soared. His handwriting improved. He was able to get down on paper what he was wanting to say very easily. And he was also, a lot more expressive at home. And his parents were blown away. This kid was 13 years old, and they couldn't believe how chatty this child was, who they thought it was just his personality that he was quiet. Turns out he had a lot to say, but before he couldn't quite put his thoughts into words. It was just too much work, and he just kind of shut down and didn't say a whole lot. So needless to say, Luke made amazing gains and so forth. And so it's really important to understand the connection between auditory processing and executive functioning, because this can really help to improve what your child is struggling with their learning difficulties, as well as to lower your frustration levels, so that it's not just like some obscure problem, that just seems like you can't get a handle on and you just got to manage. And what we ultimately want is to get to a place where we are using corrective measures. So let's get into first what is executive functioning, in case you've never heard of it or you don't know a whole lot about it. So I'm not going to get into crazy detail, but just to give you like an overview of like some symptoms or signs, is basically if your child has good executive functioning, they're able to do things like plan, organize, they have impulse control, they have reasoning, they have good memory, emotional regulation, they have a good focus and motivation, and so much more. So it's that higher cortex activity that really goes on with executive functioning, which for a lot of kids who struggle with reading and learning and behavior is often, this is not lighting up, if you will, so much as not working as well. So the path to better executive functioning starts with auditory processing issues. So let me know in the comments below if your child, if you know they have executive functioning issues, what the diagnosis is, or what signs you're seeing, or if you suspect that, because executive functioning influences a lot. And this is why stimulating the auditory nerve, that leads to basically that is connected to the auditory cortex, is so important in not only increasing your child's, energy levels, and I mean healthy energy, not hyperactivity, and their ability to process, to retain, to be organized, to plan, all that type of stuff that leads to success both in school and at home. So let's talk for a minute about the ear, because the ear is very intimately tied to the vestibular system. In auditory processing disorder, often a lot of these kids, movement, coordination, and so forth is affected because they'll have a diagnosis of dyspraxia or, dysgraphia and so forth. This is because auditory processing also affects movement and balance. So the vestibular system does so much more than just balance, if you will. It affects a child's ability to focus. I work with lots of kids who have ADHD, are really fidgety, and we work on their vestibular system, and all of a sudden mom's like, oh my God, he could sit still at the dinner table. It affects not only their coordination, but it also affects their language and their communication. So let's talk so the sound barrier that could be broken in your child. So their ear is basically like that outside part of a speaker. And you might be wondering, like, how can their ear, right? Like a mom said that to me once, how can his ear be affecting his ability to learn or behave? That's just ridiculous, right? When I start talking about the middle ear. So I want to get into that a little bit. So the middle ear, in there is the tiniest muscles and bones in the body, the hammer, the anvil, and the stapes. And basically what they do is they help to tune out the background noise, which are higher frequency, so that your child, when they're at school, can focus on the teacher talking, which is a lower frequency. The higher frequency might be like the child whispering in the background, the hum of a fan, the sound of cars going by, the racket in the classroom next door. So auditory information basically travels to the cortex, which is the auditory nerve, through the auditory nerve to the cortex. But if there is problems on that information highway, that auditory nerve and leading to the cortex, information is going to be misinterpreted. Information is going to be mixed up, or information might not even get there at all. It might not even be processed in that journey. And so by the time that information, in whatever form it comes in, reaches the language center, it is no longer accurate or the same info. And this is like where we see kids who like hear a story and they repeat it, and it's like, that's not even the same thing. They don't process instructions very well or directions very well. They can't remember information. Like, you can't give them 3 instructions. That's too overwhelming. That's very often an auditory processing issue. So if your child has a hard time filtering distractions, or has, auditory processing difficulties, there could be a dysfunction with the anvil, the hammer, and the stapes, the parts of the inner ear. It could be connected to the auditory nerve and the auditory cortex and so forth. So there's different areas where this breakdown can occur. And what this will create is a whole host of problems, and you'll end up seeing very common symptoms like sensory processing disorder, ADHD, ASD, learning difficulties, possibly even dysgraphia. It's just like very large in terms of what it affects when it comes to executive functioning and auditory processing. And basically what happens when there's this breakdown is it leads to your child feeling distracted almost because they're overloaded from this sensory information. And I see a lot of parents who are really in tune with their child who will say, like, he's ADHD, but it seems to be more that he's really, aware of the sound of the train going by, and I don't even notice it. So they're just so bombarded. And imagine how that would be if you're in your office, you're trying to work, and yet all of a sudden you're really aware of your coworker who's typing, and you're aware of the sound over here of, I don't know, somebody running water, and all of a sudden everything is the same level of sound that it's really hard to focus on what you're doing. And basically learning difficulties is, it's not what the ear is hearing, right? I talked about, I think last week, the difference between hearing and listening. But the brain is having a hard time listening or processing the auditory stimulus coming through the auditory nerve that eventually reaches the cortex. So basically, by the time it reaches the language center, it's no longer the same information. So you have a child who can't tune out background noises, has poor focus, has a really hard time getting the information the teacher's talking about. If they have poor executive functioning, they have a hard time classifying or organizing their ideas, maybe even with impulse control and all that type of stuff. And basically the brain has difficulty processing all of these messages correctly. And auditory processing is often the culprit in this situation. So obviously, my big thing is addressing the root cause of these issues. It must, to me, form the basis of any real protocol. Number one with auditory processing is nutrition, and people always think, what? But nutrition is huge. I'm going to get more into that in the coming weeks though. And exercises to retrain the auditory cortex and the auditory system and so forth. So basically, in order to correct or improve them, it's really helpful to know what's going on, first of all, with your child. You know, and I'm not saying you have to pay thousands of dollars for a diagnosis. I was just talking to a mom today who said, you know, I'm not going to pay thousands of dollars for a diagnosis. I could put my hand in the fire and be pretty darn certain that she said I'd be willing to bet that, you know, this is going on, and she wanted to put her money into kind of interventions and so forth. So if that sounds like your child, if your child struggles with executive functioning or auditory processing, please let me know in the comments below what you're seeing, what you've done to kind of help them through this. Maybe that'll help other parents out. And if you enjoyed this video, please share, and I will post a link in the comments below that will lead to a I guess you could call it a guide or a booklet that will help you with exercises, getting started exercises, a free starter kit basically to help improve auditory processing, improve focus, and so forth. So thanks for watching.